Well, I'm going to begin with some questions. How do we perceive social reality? I thought I'd start with some small questions here. How do we perceive social reality? What is objectivity? In this age of empire, how do we arrive at the truth and still retain our sanity? These are some of the questions that inform this present inquiry, if I can get through it. The usual criticism made about objectivity is that it doesn't exist. We're not just passive receptors sponging up images and information. Perception, as you know, involves selecting and omitting, organizing data into comprehensive forms. In other words, the act of perceiving something is itself an act of editing, which introduces certain kinds of distortions. There's that classical Walter Lippmann statement that he made 80 years ago. We don't see things and then define them. We define them first and then see them. But the mental selectors we use to organize our perceptions are not mostly of our own creation. Much of our personal perception is really not all that personal. Rather, it's shaped by a variety of things outside of ourselves, such as the dominant ideology, conventional social values, one's position in the social structure, the available flow of information and disinformation, the potential benefits and losses that are attached to such perceptions. There's Upton Sinclair's famous quotation where he said, "It's very difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." So Alvin Goulna, he argued that our readiness to accept or decline or reject some view rests less on the evidence and the argument that's presented for that particular view and more on how it fits our background assumptions, that is the climate of opinion. Climate of opinion was a term that Carl Becker, I think, first used, but that's very much the same. The notions that don't fit our background assumptions are seen as too far out and lacking in credibility. Today, an analogous concept might be the dominant paradigm. A paradigm is a philosophical or theoretical framework within which empirical hypotheses are drawn and scientific theories develop. That's what we usually mean by paradigm. It's developed a more popular use. It means today I think it means the dominant paradigm means the mainstream ideology. And you see bumper stickers that say subvert the dominant paradigm. And the dominant paradigm is based on the unanimity of bias. And that unanimity of bias is what passes for objectivity in mainstream discourse. Well, if objectivity is really little more than conformity of bias, then isn't one paradigm about as reliable or unreliable as another? Is all truth then nothing more than opinion or belief? If not, what makes a dissident, heterodox analysis better than an orthodox or mainstream one? Or do we lapse into a relativism which is, who's to say, you got your opinion, I got my opinion, that's that. And the fundamentalists do argue this. I heard Pope Benedict say it, and I've heard some of the televangelists say it too. They posit their fundamental absolutist beliefs as being fixed and true and reliable. And if you don't have their fundamental absolutist beliefs, then the only alternative to that is a relativism which is that anything goes and who's to say and what's true, what's not true, it doesn't matter. And what's right, what's wrong, who knows, there isn't anything like that. Well, I would argue that, in fact, that's not where we're left, that you can say that the dissenting opinion, the radical view, the views that are outside the mainstream, the views that are outside this unanimity of bias are generally, not always, but generally, are more reliable than the dominant view because they're more regularly challenged and tested against evidence. They don't get a free float down the mainstream. They're not supported by the unanimity of bias that passes for objectivity. Regarding orthodoxy, the most insidious oppressions are those that so insinuate themselves into the fabric of our lives and into the recesses of our minds that we don't even realize they're acting upon us. In the face of this, the heterodox view, the dissenting view, is not just another opinion among many. It has a special task to contest the prevailing orthodoxy, to broaden the boundaries of debate, to wake people up, to unearth suppressed data. The function of orthodox opinion is just the opposite, to keep the parameters of discourse as narrow as possible. Just listen to a presidential press conference, for instance. To dismiss evidence that ill-fits the dominant paradigm. So all opinions are not of the same value. It depends on what they're being used for, what interests they serve. We've all observed that if something doesn't fit what people believe, now you know about this, if something doesn't fit what people believe, they marshal up their reserved defenses and arguments, and sometimes very bitterly and very unyieldingly and unreceptively. It's called visiting relatives, right? Okay, how many have had this experience? You bring somebody up, no, not that experience, a new one. Hands eagerly shoot up into the air. I'm going to describe for you an example like this. You meet someone who has a firm belief about something, and you give that person contradictory data. You say, but there's this, and they say, oh, well, in that case, given that contradictory evidence and that, I now surrender my beliefs and I embrace yours. Now raise your hand if that's happened to you. Okay, your laughter is the answer to my question. I taught, years ago, I guess it was about in the 80s, I taught at Cornell University for a year as a visiting professor, and I was teaching a communications class of upperclassmen, juniors and seniors, and they, and somewhere about a third through the course, a couple of them complained and said, we're getting only one viewpoint in this class. And I said, well, no, we've got on the syllabus, we've got this reading, and I don't agree with this reading, and we discuss other questions. I said, but you know, you're right. That really the perspective in this course, the communication students, and it was a course on the media, the perspective is very critical of the existing media that you have here, and it's a very definite critique. You're right. You're getting that point of view. It's true. It was a class of about 50 students. So I said, how many of you have had other social science courses, such as sociology, political science, economics, social psychology, anthropology, history, whatever, communications courses? And every hand went up. Everybody had at least 3 or 4 or more social science courses. I said, and how many of you in all those other courses got this point of view? Not a single hand went up. A measure of the ideological pluralism and diversity of Cornell University. And then I said, and how many of you in those other courses complained that you were getting only one point of view? In all those other courses that you took. Again, not a hand went up. I said, so you're not complaining that you're getting only one point of view. You're complaining that for the first time you're getting a second point of view, and you can't tolerate it. Now, if people cannot challenge the validity of the evidence you present, they have fallback positions. I remember the Moscow intellectuals, back when there was a Soviet Union, back in the 1980s. There was a very interesting article written, of all places, in the National Review, a conservative right-wing magazine, where the author described the Moscow intellectuals as loving Ronald Reagan, Marlboro cigarettes, and the Confederacy during the Civil War. And that, I thought, was a very accurate description, given the ones I met when I was there. They hated socialism. And a friend of mine, she had the same experience. This happened to be, she was in Leningrad with the Soviet intellectuals there. And one guy said to her, he said, the poorest people in your country live better than I do. And here's a guy who had gone to Moscow University. He spoke fluent English. He had a small but comfortable apartment. He had a wall full with books. He'd never missed a meal in his life, but he was convinced that the poorest in your country, in America, and when I used to hear him talk, their eyes would begin to sparkle, America. And she said, well, that's not true. We have people in our country who sleep in doorways and pick through garbage cans and such. And you know what they said to her? They said, that's all right, you don't have to lie to us anymore. And she said, no, really. And she cited some statistics and was talking about this. She said, what's the fallback, the first fallback position? Where did you get those figures from? She said, from the federal government, Bureau of Labor Statistics, U.S. Census Bureau. It's public knowledge. So their second fallback position, they say, oh, those are just the blacks. The blacks, they're lazy and stupid, and so, yeah, they're poor, yeah. That's a rhetorical fallback position. I've given that a technical term, descriptive term, and I forgot what I did. Oh, yes, racism. I call that racism. So it so happened that she had a copy of Mother Jones with her, and there was a special photo feature in that issue of the poor of Appalachia. 30 years after Kennedy's war on poverty in Appalachia, these people were as poor as ever, and there were pictures of their destitution. And so she brought this out. She said, look, Appalachia, they're all white, 90, 97, 99%, sort of like Seattle. But and she said, look at this. And they looked at the pictures, and they had another fallback position, which was what? Oh, so there were a few white people who are poor out in the country, and so that's so unusual they made a whole article with photographs about them. You see, so beliefs are not surrendered. Beliefs are rather are frighteningly impervious to evidence sometimes. The Soviet intellectuals believed America was a capitalist paradise. They knew, by the way, when I spoke to the ones I spoke to in Moscow, they knew so much more about America than I did. I was handicapped by experience and reality, which is a messy kind of multidimensional thing. They had all the certainty of inexperience. The believers in the capitalist paradise were a mirror image of the believers those who believed that the Soviet Union was a workers' paradise. And there were many people who I knew, people in the party and fellow travelers and such, who had heard so much negative. I mean, everything about these communist countries was bad. There wasn't ever a single positive thing ever said. So their reaction was to reject every single criticism. The girlfriend I had right back then, too, in the 80s, she was a party member. And I remember I would raise questions, you see, not from a position of hostility, but from a position of I'd like this system to work a lot better and be more viable. And said, look, there were real problems here. And we would end up in really banging heads together. It was just impossible to have a rational discussion and introduce things. I can think of another lady I know who, now that was in New York. Well, my girl, I lived in, it doesn't matter. This was another friend of mine, red diaper, a third-generation Communist Party, and she says to me, now this was a woman in her late 40s, an experienced woman, and she says, there's no prostitution in the Soviet Union. I said, Esther, what are you talking about? So this is a country of 340 million people, wars, scarcities, all the imperfections of human beings, and self-serving exploitations and motives. Are you telling me in this whole country there's no prostitution? She says, there's no prostitution. A year later, I headed a delegation to the Soviet Union made up of economists and political scientists, and I remember our guide in Moscow. She said, again, she was a woman about late 40s, early 50s. She said, there is no prostitution in my country. You see, now we're trying to explore the nature of belief here. How do people have belief? And I said to her, I said, you know, there may not be any prostitution in your country, but there sure is a hell of a lot of it in our hotel right here downstairs. And you know what she said without missing a beat? God damn it. No, she didn't say that. I just said it. That's okay. It's okay. Sit down. Without missing a beat, she said, yes, well, I want you to know all those girls have full-time jobs during the day. Talk about fallback position. So people, you're not, if you're engaged in political discourse and political struggle, as I am all the time in political communication, you realize that you're not doing politics. You're doing religion. It's religion you're dealing with because you're dealing with belief. And it's a rough deal. I mean, it's with good reason that we use words like political dogma and sectarian. These are religious terms, you know. Talking about the Soviet Union, let me talk about it, and I'm doing it deliberately because it's such a taboo subject. I can just think of very, very eminent progressive speakers who cannot get 2 feet into U.S. foreign policy back in the 80s and 90s, and even till today they still do it without mentioning the monstrous Soviet Union, the horrible Soviet Union. The 2 most eminent do it all the time. I won't even give any names. But I want to say, I thought of the Soviet Union rather differently. I thought it had certain features, and this was why I think I got attacked as Stalinist, Soviet apologist, and all that. I thought the Soviet Union had certain features that were worth emulating. And even after its overthrow, I thought it had certain features that were worth keeping, such as universal health care, free education, affordable housing, and all other such components of what people on the left call the social wage. It's a Marxist term. Well, all of that's gone now. That's been destroyed at great suffering for the population, especially among pensioners and older, more vulnerable people, and among younger people, and among women. Professional women who have to turn to prostitution, the fastest growing profession in the former Soviet Union. All the public capital has been stolen by private swindlers and speculators. Stephen Cohn, very good Sovietologist, wrote that very fine biography on Bukharin, one of the old Bolsheviks who was purged, you know. He said, that country, Russia today, is living off the corpse of the Soviet capital, of what was once there, and it's doomed. Well, I advocated at that time, and I still do now to historians, that what we should do is look at the Soviet Union, to use another social science term, with, what is the term? Object differential appraisal. That you look at it and you think, differential object appraisal. You make a differential object appraisal. You see it not as one monolithic thing, not as a worker's paradise, not as a monstrous hell, but you look at in many different facets and sides, its crimes, its successes, its failures. You know, one thing you can say about communist Russia and communist China is they took hundreds of millions of people, moved from feudal serfdom to a modern society where they had enough to eat and went to school and had literacy. An incredible, hundreds of millions of people, an accomplishment never emulated before or since in human history. And so, can we look at that without sharpening our knives and always having to make your genuflection to the anti-communism? It was and still is forbidden to say anything positive about that system. But apparently, many people in Russia today agree with me. Look at the study done in 2005, just a few years ago, by Richard Pipes, a leading Harvard Sovietologist. I used to call him a leading Harvard anti-Sovietologist. He was one of those guys who led the charge in the Cold War against the imaginary hordes of Marxists who were all over the place. As you know, were taking over America and American academia and all. I don't know what part of Harvard he was teaching in. Well, Pipes did this study in 2005. It was a very exhaustive and extensive opinion research study in Russia, a survey, and he found painfully, uncomfortably, unhappily, he found, I will give him credit, he published, he went public with it. If this study had been done by the White House, it would have been suppressed. We would never have heard of it. He found that in Russia, the great majority are no longer in love with the capitalist paradise. Now that they're living in it, you know, they had a different feeling. Here's the datum that's most salient. 74% regret the demise of the Soviet Union and believe that life was better under communism. Similar results, by the way, similar studies have been done with similar results in other communist countries. I can think offhand of Bulgaria and Poland. Such things are reported in the Western press, have been for the last decade or more, but with no explanation and with relatively little comment. Except in the early years, that was their fallback position, which is, well, these people are all so unhappy because they are used to being taken from cradle to grave and being told what to do and feel, and now they're cut adrift and they don't know how to exercise self-reliance and self-initiative, and so they're unhappy with this system. See, it's just a feeling. That's the fallback position, and it is true. You know, when you get thrown out of your job and your pension disappears and you're kicked out of your rent control apartment, it does do something to your sense of self-reliance. When the orthodox view becomes so entrenched, evidence becomes irrelevant. The demonization of the Serbian people and their democratically elected president, Slobodan Milosevic, I'm giving you the hard cases today. Right? No one has ever accused me of shirking or trimming. Some have wished that I would. Some have sidled up to me and advised me to do that. They would tell me that you will reach more people if you say less. You'll have a greater impact if you dilute your punch. Well, The demonization of the Serbs was one of the great propaganda achievements that took in many liberals and progressives also. I wrote a book about that called To Kill a Nation, The Attack on Yugoslavia. Carla Del Ponte, the hanging judge at that kangaroo court put up in the Prague by the NATO powers. They set it up in the Prague to make it look like it's part of the World Court or something. It was the independent tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. She admitted last year that the prosecution in this case had no evidence to support the charge of genocide against Milosevic and the Serbs. And Milosevic was launching his defense, a very effective one. His cross-examination, he was demolishing. There were people getting up on the stand who were admitting that this was all fabricated, that they weren't there, that they didn't know, that they never saw the atrocity, that they were told they had to do this or they would get deported or blah, blah, blah. Things like that were happening. It was amazing. That's why you never heard any of it in the media. And then Milosevic's defense disappeared because he died suddenly. Serbia, in fact, I want to give you just one datum. Serbia is the only republic, not Slovenia, not Montenegro, not Croatia, not Bosnia. Serbia is the only republic that still is multi-ethnic. You have Albanians and Croatians and Bosnians living in Serbia. I can tell you, that's one of the great facts. That's one of the datum that's been dropped down the memory hole. Serbia is the only republic that has not done ethnic cleansing, and yet it's the one that has been charged with ethnic cleansing. And you can get that evidence right from UN reports and right from the mainstream media, actually. Radical publications like the Wall Street Journal, which every so often carries a good story, which you should appreciate, because once Rupert Murdoch buys it, you can use it to line your garbage can after that. Now, I'll give you some other hard ones like that. The stolen election of 2004. I think I put that article, I know I put it on my website, michaelparenti.org. Go take a look at that. People allowed that there was some finagling in Florida in 2000, but in 2004 the media came rushing in to legitimate the election. We couldn't go another 2-3 weeks, a spectacle to the world. No, Bush had won it, despite the enormous theft, great evidence of theft of all kinds in Ohio, Florida, New Mexico, Nevada. My article summarizes remarkable work done by Congressman John Conyers, or writers like Bob Fitrakis, Harvey Wasserman, Steve Freeman, and there was one or two other. What? Mark Crispin Miller, thank you, because I relied on him a lot, and I couldn't remember the name. Yeah. Here's another one, the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. It wasn't an invasion. The left military government 3 times asked the Soviets in, and they were very reluctant to go in, and then they finally did. And what was that government doing? That government was doing very terrible things like having women go to school, land reform, breaking the feudal tribes, trying to allow for room for a secular society. The Shangri-La image of Tibet before the Chinese crackdown. Try to discuss that. I live in a Tibet country. I've been living in it about 15 years. It's called Berkeley, California, and see what happens there. And the stuff that I got hit with on that one. And by the way, every one of these I have written about and taken a stand on. The findings of the Warren Commission about the JFK assassination, the research on that is just marvelous. From the forensic, the medical, the cover-up research is just incredible, the wealth of research. But try to get a rational discourse in the mainstream on that one. The findings or non-findings of the 9/11 Commission. There are many unanswered questions about 9/11 that really do need further investigation. I mean, would you really accept a commission that's been handpicked by George Bush? Think of it that way. Doing a class power analysis of the American political system, or talking about class power in any context. Such issues as these, and there must be others, I don't say that's an exhaustive list, cross the boundary of allowable opinion. They move into forbidden terrain, and you are just very often denied the opportunity for rational discourse. Through a process of immediate assertion and intensive repetition. Repetition, it just comes. The genocide thing on the Serbs, I remember, there was no evidence. The first day it appeared in the Times, it was with quotes, that this genocide, and then the next day quotes, and then the quotes were dropped, and then the word, as it was used, it becomes easier and easier to use. The intensive repetition, through this method, the universe of discourse is preempted and it's monopolized. As to what then is truth, we perhaps can back into that question. The way we can answer it by backing into it, by saying that we know truth exists because we know liars exist. We may not always know when our leaders are lying to us, but after a while we catch on. You know the saying, you can't fool all the people all the time, but if you do it once, it's good for 4 years, right? And what if 4 years it was, and then another 4 years we're in it still. What's often missing from public discourse and mainstream political study is the political economic content of something, of the issue. The media are amazing. They can tell you about this, and there were people there, and others were, but they don't tell you what's the issue, what is the conflict about, what's the substance of it, why are all these things going on, what's the goal. You can read American government textbooks of the standard mainstream variety, and you'll read that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is a voice of the business community. These textbooks will often have a section called Public Interest Groups, and you have the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And just as the AFL-CIO is for labor, it's always balanced in these books, they're always balanced. What you usually don't get is the politico-economic content of this politico-economic organization known as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. You don't hear, you don't read that for almost a century, the Chamber opposed laws that legalized labor unions. It opposed collective bargaining. It was against the abolition of child labor. It was against fair labor practices. It was against minimum wage increases. It was against legal protections for workers as under the NLRB. It was against regulations to protect the economy. You don't hear that. How can they talk about the Chamber of Commerce without ever really saying what it does? I'm reminded of something C. Wright Mills said years ago, that in the face of such informational vapidity, is there such a word as vapidity? Vapor? Vapidity? Did I just make that up? What? There is now. Actually, in the assassination of Julius Caesar, I did invent a word. It was about, the Roman aristocracy always has 3 names: Gaius, Julius, Caesar. Tullius, what his name is, Tiberius, Cicero, whatever. And I call them trinomina. These trinomina. Beautiful word. I've used it again in a later thing, too. It'll catch on, you'll see. Say, oh. Okay, what was I saying? Vapidity. C. Wright Mills saying, in the face of such informational vapidity and cover-up, simple facts can have the import of radical acts. And we see that with this administration. We're just bringing forth certain simple facts about certain things. This is treated like an act of radical rebellion, which in effect it is, in its impact it is. Now this slighting of content, this avoiding political economic content is a common means of maintaining the dominant paradigm. Never go too far into social reality. Never cross any lines beyond permissible opinion. I remember one time in the American Political Science Association, we were having this big debate of the decade or something. It was Philip Green and I against Philip Green of Smith College, me, and we were debating Nelson Polsby and Aaron Wildofsky of University of California Political Science, Berkeley. And I remember at one point turning to Wildofsky and saying, how can you teach and write about the American presidency for 35 years without ever once mentioning capitalism? Well, the look on his face, he startled like I was Donald Duck or something. I don't know. He just was looking, and it occurred to me that this was the first time in those 35 years he had ever been asked that question. So the absence of political economic content is a chronic thing. It's evident in the discussion about empire also. When I was writing that book, The Assassination of Julius Caesar, I have a section on empire in that, but the book is not mostly about imperialism or empire or conquest. It's about the internal politics of the Roman Republic. But when I was writing that book, I was reading a lot about empire, and I discovered something very, very interesting, that most of the literature on empire is kind of favorable toward empire. It's kind of admiring of empire. That, empires are seen as grand accomplishments, as bringing stability where there had been chaos, bringing peace and dominion among these squabbling tribes, You see that in those movies, too, The greatness of Rome. You must remember Rome. And we're all supposed to be sitting there going, Rome, whoa, whoa. And those are my ancestors, We even give empires peace names. Pax Romana, Pax Britannica. Empires, but I'll tell you one thing. I'll tell you that later. Empires are also often seen as innocent, unintentional accretions. They arise stochastically. Stochasticism, write it down, stochasticism is the theory that things happen by chance or random, that you can't see consistent patterns in this way. Just stuff happens. That's the way it is. I remember in my salad days hearing that the British Empire was put together in a fit of absent-mindedness. That used to be a phrase. Used to hear that. I heard teachers say that to me. British historian Cyril Robinson, I quote him in the Caesar book, he says the same thing about the Roman Empire. Quote, "It was perhaps almost as true of Rome as of Great Britain, that she acquired her world domination in a fit of absence of mind." Yeah, right. More recently, Robinson was writing back in the 1940s, I think. More recently, how about 2003, The Economist, an eminent conservative British publication, very eminent as you know, wrote the following in an unsigned editorial about, in August 2003, about 4 months after the invasion of Iraq by U.S. forces, and this unsigned article was addressing that invasion, and it began like this: "Empires are born in funny ways, and sometimes via the law of unintended consequences by accident." Empires are born by accident. There it is, accident. Well, I'm sorry. Empires are not innocent, absent-minded, accidental, unintentional accretions. They are given force by purpose-driven rulers who consciously have to mobilize vast amounts of men and materials to conquer and plunder far-off places. I mean, the British didn't just happen to find themselves in India, you know. Oh, look, fancy this. Thought we were going to go vacation in Greece, and we took a turn, and, well, we're here now. We might as well plunder the place and rip it all to pieces and get rich off it. How's the accent? Pretty good? Yeah. But the term empire was never applied to the United States. When I was a kid in class, there was a map, I remember, of the United States, and then there were these inserts on the sides. Puerto Rico, Alaska, Hawaii weren't yet states. Don't do the numbers, forget about it. I was a very old kid. I was I was a very, very young, brilliant, young, 2 years old at the time. The Philippines, yes, the Philippines was, and I remember we said to the teacher, "Are those our colonies?" And the teacher, Miss Myers, she said, "America does not have colonies. Those are our territories." What's in a word, hey? The power of labeling. So you didn't talk about, when I wrote my book, Against Empire, in 1995, there were a few people who commented, empire, come on, Parenti, aren't you going over the top here? Talking about critique of U.S. interventionism, it's one thing. That's a bit much. The U.S. doesn't pursue empires. It propagates democracy, as we all know. But you know, by 2000, 2001, suddenly all these books started coming out with the title of empire in them. The Twilight of Empire, The Sorrows of Empire, The Follies of Empire, Empire at the Crossroads, Empire Going to Get Your Mama, you know, I mean, every kind of... Even conservatives started using the word. The conservative pundits who overpopulate the Sunday talk shows and all these panel shows, opinion panel shows, they were all starting to say things like, we're an empire, and we got to accept the fact we're an empire, and we've got to start acting like an empire. It's time we started acting, and we've got to take on the responsibilities. It's as if, since we have this power, we have the entitlement. That power gives you some kind of moral entitlement to go out there and whack other countries if you want. Well, I started asking myself, how is it that so many people now suddenly feel free to talk about empire when they mean U.S. empire, not the wicked Soviet empire or the British empire or the Mongol or Persian empires? No, U.S. empire. How is it they're saying this? What am I missing? And I realized it wasn't something that I was missing. It's something that they were missing. That is, I realized that the word had been divested of its full meaning. Empire seems to mean, when most of these people write about it, it means simply dominion and power. What is missing from the public discourse is the process of empire, and even more important, the political, economic content. For while we say a lot about this word, everybody's using this word now, empire, there's another word that's missing. There's another word that's missing that's very closely related to empire, and nobody ever uses it except a few of us. And that other word is imperialism. Now, isn't that fascinating? How can you talk about empire without ever mentioning imperialism? Because imperialism is the process of empire. Empires do imperialism. That's what they do. They do imperialism. It's like going to a medical conference of pulmonary specialists and they're all talking about our lungs and never once mentioning breathing. You know, you got to say, what is missing from this picture? Well, Imperialism is not only the process, it's the political, economic content. Imperialism is when the ruling interests of one country expropriate the land, the labor, the natural resources, and the capital and the markets of another country. Imperialism means plunder and tribute. Empires are not just all about power. It's not power for power's sake. Nobody goes out and just goes and does power. Oh, let's go to Africa and conquer chunks of Africa because then we'll feel more powerful. You know, you go to Africa because there's something there that you want. It's one of the richest places in the world. That's where you got, tin, copper, diamonds, gold, hemp, timber, human beings, slaves, all the stuff that enriches you. That's what King Leopold, he didn't have any grudge about the people in the Congo. He didn't care one way or another about who they were, where they were, whether they lived or died. He just wanted them and work them in those mines so that he could get richer and richer and richer. So it's not power for power's sake. It's power to get your wealth and using your wealth to increase your power and using your power to maximize and secure your wealth. That's what it's about. That's what the guys who are in the White House today are doing. So it's plunder, it's tribute, it's these rich resources, it's expropriating the land, the crops, the cheap labor. Empires are enormously profitable, mostly for the ruling and investing class of the imperial country. Empires are enormously costly for the common populace, both of the targeted country and of the imperial country itself. The empire feeds off the republic's resources. Where the hell do you think this empire comes from? It comes from the republic. Where do they get the money for these 380 military bases and these bombings and killings and shootings and destruction? They get it from our tax dollars. The people pay the taxes and do without essentials so that the patricians can pursue their far-off plunder. The center is bled so that the perimeter can expand and expand and expand. And you see that happening. We live in a country that has a runaway defense budget just this past year, $487 billion. That's just the basic Pentagon defense budget. It doesn't count another $124 billion for Iraq, another $30 or $40 billion for Afghanistan. And at home, what do we have? We've got public hospitals closing. We got libraries cutting back their hours. We got goddamn sound systems that don't even work. Now you know why I'm angry. We got conservation programs being cut. We got Medicare under siege because we can't afford it. And we can't afford it. Where are we going to get all that money from? I got to work on my George Bush imitation, I know. We got education funding being cut back. What they do in the world, U.S. rulers, they do on purpose. They know what they're doing. Just because they mislead you and confuse you or us doesn't mean that they are necessarily confused. They may say all sorts of misleading things. A political writer, Lawrence McGuire, he sent me his article. I wrote a piece. Maybe I should tell you about this. Am I going too long? You want me to stop now? Other people have spoken. All right. I wrote an article, and you can. It's not on my website, but Common Dreams has it posted. It's called Mystery: How Wealth Creates Poverty in the World. And I pointed out that as U.S. investment has increased over the last half century dramatically in the third world, and U.S. and IMF and World Bank loans have increased in the third world, and U.S. aid to the third world has increased. While all of this has gone on for a half a century, during that half a century, poverty has increased. Today, the number of people living in poverty is growing at a faster rate than the world's population. So as wealth accumulates, poverty spreads because there's a dynamic interrelation between the two. And I said, so here's the mystery. Why is that a mystery? It's such a conundrum. How do we figure this out? Well, there's no mystery, really. Unless you assume that these investors and these aid people and these bankers manipulating this debt are doing all this to help the people in these countries, if you drop that assumption and you say they're doing it to help themselves, then it's a perfectly rational system. They're making tremendous amounts of money. These investments aren't designed to uplift the people, to build up their domestic industries, to give them a viable economy, to make their food supply secure, and those things. These investments are there to get them off the land, to take the wealth out of them, to reduce the price of their labor down to shantytown starvation levels. And so is the aid. The aid, all these countries have to buy it from U.S., and so with the debt, the loans are sent in, and then they're trapped in the loan, and then they're hit with more money sent to them, and they're forced to do SAPs, it's called SAPs, Structural Adjustment Programs, which means cut back on all your own domestic subsidies and development and all that. So these programs are designed to impoverish these people, and they've been very successful. And the liberal critic comes along and says, this isn't working, because he's smarter. He's so much smarter than all these people who've been doing this all this while. No, he isn't. He's the dumbest one in the room. He always thinks that American foreign policy is so stupid and so confused, and our dealings with these countries are off on a wrong leg and all that. Why? Well, Larry McGuire writes to me, he says, I loved your article, and it answered the question that I posed in mine. And I wish I could just read his piece, because I liked his piece. I wrote him back. But he was trying to understand international finance and what happened in Argentina. And he read three liberal writers. He read Mark Cooper of The Nation, Mark Cooper, who never met a U.S. war he didn't love and support. And he supported the destruction of Yugoslavia, a viable social democracy. He supported the Gulf War. He supports this war in Iraq right now. Mark Weisbrot and Paul Krugman of the New York Times. All three of them writing about Argentina. And McGuire, with feigned innocence, he notes that all three said that Argentina had been a gold mine for international investors and big speculators, a source of huge profits. You remember when Argentina crashed, when the whole economy went into a burnout. It just went down some years ago. This is what we're talking about. The IMF forced Argentina to slash its protective tariffs, privatize its state enterprises, and transfer huge sums from Argentine taxpayers to the pockets of the big money people and the IMF. McGuire, he notes that Cooper, Weisbrot, and Krugman condemned the crisis in Argentina, that these three say that the IMF, and these are various quotes, created a failed model, the program was an error, a catastrophic failure, a failed experiment, a disaster. But McGuire says, how so? Agreed, it was a disaster for the Argentinians and for Argentina. But the free market IMF policies made Wall Street cheer, as Krugman himself said, and it reaped billions for investors. In other words, the policy worked very well for a small group of very wealthy people. Isn't that what the policy was supposed to do? McGuire asks. The IMF has pursued these same policies in many other countries. If an institution does the same thing over and over again with profitable results, why is it a failure? Because it brought hardship to the people of these countries? What's that got to do with getting rich? As McGuire says, I quote him, I would call it a well-crafted policy that must work for the people implementing that policy. Otherwise, why would they continue doing it? What's experimental about it? It's been done. They've been doing it for 40 years. What do you mean? Krugman called it an experimental policy that's gone wrong. We've got to stop it. So why do Cooper, Weisbrot, and Krugman call it a failure? I'm going to tell you why right now. This is why you paid your $10. Now's the moment you're going to hear the real lowdown. What was the question again? Why do they call it a failure? They call it a failure because they want to stay within the dominant paradigm. They prefer to make a liberal complaint rather than a radical analysis. They assume a community of interest between the plutocratic investors and the working people of the recipient countries, when in fact there is no community of interest between those two. These three have no class analysis of the IMF. They assume that the rich plunderers who make billions off the IMF are primarily interested in helping others rather than in helping themselves. They avoid all mention of that old Roman question, cui bono. That's Latin. It means what? Who benefits? That's right. Who's getting it? Who's benefit? This is being done because somebody is benefiting it in most cases. Now the same for the war in Iraq. That the reasons given by the administration to justify that war, weapons of mass destruction, Al-Qaeda links to Hussein, that these reasons have proven false, doesn't mean that the policy is imbecilic. As I said to you already, because our rulers try to mislead us and confuse us, doesn't mean that they themselves are confused. The war in Iraq, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, the war in Iraq is not a stupid blunder. It's not a well-intentioned undertaking that went wrong. Iraq has been very good for a number of interests. It served notice to the Middle East and the world that countries that chart an independent, self-defining, self-developing course will be destroyed. That's just what Cheney said yesterday on that aircraft carrier about Iran, that it might try to emerge as a regional power, and we've got to make sure that doesn't happen. There are really very disturbing things about Iran. You know, you have a new literacy rate of up to 80%, the social wages being built up, they're recycling oil profits right back into the economy in some cases. Many, many things wrong with Iran, especially with the condition of women. I'm not trying to say that's a society we should aspire for. But what bothers them is that here's a country that's charting an independent course. It's not putting itself under the free market global system. And that's what was wrong with Iraq. Saddam Hussein, and here's something, if you want to look at amnesia in the media, Saddam Hussein was Washington's poster boy years ago. The Iraqi people had a revolution in 1958, and they kicked out the British and American oil companies, and they built a democratic country. Every time they talk about we've got to go in there and teach the Iraqis democracy, there's a lie. There's the lie of omission. They forget that they had a democracy. They had a constitutional government, a prime minister. Saddam Hussein's first gig with the CIA was to shoot the prime minister, which he did. He didn't kill him. We just wounded him, and the CIA got him out and brought him to Syria. He later on worked his way in, and with his death squads, he killed, or he drove into exile, or he drove underground every constitutionalist, every progressive, every reformer, every Democrat, every communist in the country who had formed this coalition. He even then killed and slaughtered and murdered the whole left wing of his own Ba'athist party. This is the part they never tell you about Saddam Hussein. And then when he was doing that, he was Washington's poster boy. They loved him. They gave him aid. They gave him a good chunk of the oil market. They gave him. They sigged him on Iran to go fight, do a proxy war for them against Iran. He was everything. But then he started committing economic nationalism. He kept the economy state-owned. He trained cadres of engineers. He did not turn Iraq into a free market client state. He did not open it up to global international investment. He did not say, come on in, boys, it's all yours. The land, the labor, the resources, the oil, everything. It's all yours. Just give me and my brother Jose or Abdul, whatever part of the country it is, the client leader will say, just give me and my brother Pierre payoff and all that, and we'll take care and keep the people in line for you. He didn't do that. He was a right-winger conservative, but he did keep a lot of these social programs anyway. That didn't fit very well. Iraq was the example. It was a bad example for the Middle East. It was the example, the danger of a good example. We call it that. If every country in the Middle East starts doing that, or in the world, what happens to the empire? What happens to our free market global system of earning billions and billions and billions of dollars off the sweat, labor, and land and resources of these people? So that was accomplished. You see, this war did accomplish something. It took an independent, self-defining, self-developing country and destroyed it. Making the world that much safer for the free market global empire. If you want to know what kind of empire the U.S. has, it's a free market empire. Iraq was good for other people. 100 companies made billions in government contracts. Most of them are getting out now because the situation is becoming so untenable. 113 billion barrels of quality crude. At today's prices, we're talking about $6 or $7 trillion. The biggest resource grab in history. Saddam was granting concessions to Russia, China, Brazil, Italy, Malaysia, France. All those concessions no longer exist. They're gone. It's the U.S. and Great Britain, this last March, the accords that worked out. If and when they want to get all that, they get all that oil out. A lot of it is also to keep the oil off the market, to keep the oil prices up. And that was the fight. The first Gulf War with Daddy Bush, that's what the whole fight was. That Saddam wanted a larger oil quota, and he wasn't getting it. And if he did, that would bring oil prices down. That's not my conspiracy theory. That's not my lefty conspiracy theory. That was right in the goddamn New York Times business page. It just said, Iraqi oil might threaten price floors, blah, blah, blah. Oil concessions were taken away from these other countries. Okay. The Iraq War also allowed the U.S. to impose, the White House to impose record increases in the defense budget by 30, 40%, depending on how you calculate that defense budget. Iraq had switched from dollars to euros as its reserved currency, that is the currency that any other country will take. It's your backup currency. Not anymore. That was a danger. That was a real danger to U.S. creditors and speculators and international dollar finance, which it's back on the dollar. One of the first things that happened is Iraq has switched back from euros to dollars. Iraq supported Palestinian liberation. Not anymore. Iraq had an entirely state-owned economy. Not anymore. Everything has been privatized or destroyed, one way or the other. Iraq was prosperous and of some influence in the Middle East. Not anymore. Iraq today is a total basket case. It's a disaster. It's worse than Haiti. It may never recover, not for the next foreseeable 1 or 2 or 3 generations. I don't know. It's just terrible what's happened. Iraq, all right. That's it. Now, this is not U.S. ignorance or confusion at work. This is not good intentions gone awry. It is deliberate, conscious reactionism and imperialism. Bush and Cheney knew what they wanted to do, and they have done it for the most part. It's true they did miscalculate. It's true they thought the insurgency would be minor, that people would, they may have even convinced themselves that people were going to throw flowers out and greet them and all that. It's true they got a politically costly war that they didn't expect to have. But that doesn't mean they didn't accomplish anything. They've accomplished quite a bit from their perspective. And the empire can lose the war, that is, go home after it's destroyed the country. That's what happened in Vietnam. I don't think they lost the war in Vietnam. Vietnam never really recovered. It now has to take a capital road. I was in Vietnam 2 years ago, and they're telling me that the third generation is suffering from more birth deformities than ever as the recessive genes combine from all the Agent Orange that went in there, and you can see. I've seen photographs of monster births that you don't ever want to see. You just don't ever want to see. And these kids are alive, too. And so I'm almost done. This brings us to another question about how to think about how we think. Do those who put forth the lies of empire believe what they tell us? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. That an opinion serves my self-interest doesn't mean that I embrace it hypocritically. It might mean, because it so well serves my self-interest, that what? I embrace it all the more eagerly and sincerely. I believe it.
Might be doublethink.
It seems very persuasive for the very fact that it's so serviceable. So, do these people in the White House, do they believe in the dominant paradigm? They sure do. It defines their world for them. It assures them of their self-worth. They believe, along with one of their progenitors from 2 centuries ago, Alexander Hamilton, that the country should be run by the rich and the well-born, and it should be run for the rich and the well-born. They completely believe they are deserving of their station in life. It's called Yale, Harvard, Princeton. As has been said, George Bush Sr. was born on third base, and he grew up thinking he had hit a triple. They believe that America should lead the world and that they should lead America. And they believe the poor are the authors of their own poverty. Just listen to Barbara Bush when she holds forth on that. And the working class are a troublesome lot who need to be reined in along with the middle class, both of whom have to ratchet down their standard of living and their level of expectations a lot more so that the people at the top can get still richer. See, there's only one thing that ruling classes have ever wanted throughout all of history, and that's everything. They want all the best lands, all the resources, all the grains, all the herds, all the gold, the silver, everything. They want all the comforts and protections of civil life, and all the amenities, and while having to pay none of the costs. They want everything. They want you to have all the burdens, and they want all the privileges. Now, do they believe the propaganda they put out in support of specific policies? Well, sometimes they do deliberately fabricate and seem to be aware of it. You know it when you catch them in inconsistencies, when they say one thing one day, another thing the next day. I mean, Alberto Gonzalez, and he said, I didn't know about it. Oh, yeah, I knew about it. Oh, yeah, this. Well, it wasn't that much. Well, it was that. Well, I don't know. I can't remember. Well, when they suffer from amnesia, they have amnesia problems. He couldn't remember what was it, about 65 times or something. John Mitchell during Watergate, he had memory problems about 120 times. I don't know, or I can't remember, about 120 times. And you can go on with these things. Much of the time, though, truth is not even a consideration. It's more like the advertising world. Advertisers don't strive to create truths. They strive to create a sale. The prime consideration is selling a product, not the truth. The question you ask is, will it sell? That's the truth. If it sells, then it's, quote, true, in heavy quote marks. is the message effective? Is it getting across? If it works, then it's true, and we'll go with it. If it doesn't, then it's discarded. The approach is purely instrumental. Truth is a purely instrumental thing. Does it serve our ends or not? I'll give you a recent example of that. The recent propaganda line of, you people want to cut and run, but we want to stay the course. We're going to stay the course. Do you know that the Bush team has dropped that phrase, stay the course, because they found out that the public didn't like it. It sounded like we're going to be there forever. And people are asking, what's your plan? What's your game? What's your exit plan? You know? And so they dropped stay the course. Now, was it true? Were they being sincere when they said stay the course? Or are they being sincere now when they dropped it? You go figure. At what exact psychological point the self-serving, manipulative, lying sentence is believed by the liar himself is something that's maybe hard to locate, and it's really not all that important. Do they believe in their own virtue? Yes, of course. All people, all parties, all national leaders, all movements believe in their own virtue. But even more so, more than anything else in the world, more than truth, more than if this is a real question in their mind or not, more than all of that, with the utmost ferocity and dedication and determination, they believe in protecting and advancing their own interests. That's what they believe in. If you want to know what they believe in, that's what they believe in. If you want to know what their religion is, it's not Jesus Christ, it's that, what I just said. It's Jesus' wallet. But there is, let me finish by saying, there is room for hope, brothers and sisters. There is room for hope. There sometimes are limits to how well officialdom and the corporate press can finesse reality. Sometimes reality keeps getting in the way. I was talking to somebody, this was years ago, a young guy who had been in Germany. He had been a school kid in Germany during World War II. And I said, well, did you believe all this stuff? He said, well, you know, after a while, propaganda can go just so far. Because we kept hearing about the victorious German armies were vanquishing our foes and going across. But we kept noticing that the battles were being fought all closer on the map. On there, the battles were being fought closer and closer to Germany's borders. And then the battles were being fought inside Germany, and we realized that our armies were in retreat. And that, in fact, we were losing the war. And something of the same reality principle applies to Vietnam and Iraq. Officialdom and the lapdog press could not totally ignore the awful and persistent actuality of the war. And that reality sets the limits, is itself the limits of propaganda. It's the limits of propaganda itself. That's as far as you can go. I mean, however, even in those cases, even in the case of the debate about Iraq today, the dominant paradigm still envelops it. Because the debate, and it was true of Vietnam too, in Vietnam the debate was between those who said we could win the war and those who said we could not. Those of us who said that's not even the question. We should not even be fighting this horrible war. If we won, it'll be all the worse. This war doesn't represent the interests of the Vietnamese people. It doesn't represent the interests of the American people. It's a horrible crime against humanity. Those of us who said that did not get in the mainstream debate back in the 60s and 70s. And that's the same thing is happening, you see, with Iraq now. This thing's gone wrong. It's a failed policy. Now let's get the hell out and blah, blah, blah. The implication is if it had gone better, if we killed more people at the right time, it'd be perfectly all right to be there. So keep in mind one thing, that indoctrination into the dominant paradigm does not operate with perfect effect. If it worked with perfect effect, you would not be able to understand what I was saying now. I would not be able to say what I'm saying now. I would be saying something else. This would be a Republican National Committee meeting or something. In the face of all monopolistic ideological manipulation, people still develop a skepticism toward the official ideology. Reality is a problem for the ruling class. Remember that. Reality is a problem for them. Reality is not a problem for us. They are the ones who have to finesse reality and misrepresent reality. Reality is radical. Just remember that. When we say that there's terrible environmental devastation, that's not something we are conjuring up out of our radical ideology. That's reality, you see. When we say poverty is growing faster than the world's population, that's reality. That's not some argument we're making, you see. When we're saying that wages are flat and the top fraction of 1% is making more money than they ever did before, and they've got these immense multi-billion-dollar tax cuts, that's not something we imagined. That's reality. And they have got to deal and explain that. When we say that Social Security has been the most successful human service program that this country's ever produced, the most successful anti-poverty program, as inadequate and insufficient as it is, and it's a three-pronged program, remember, it's not just pensions, it's also disability insurance, and it's also survivor's insurance. That's reality. And those hooligans have to lie. They have to tell you they're concerned about Social Security. They don't want to see it go defunded. And here's what we'll do. We'll just break it up into little pieces and toss it into Wall Street. And people don't buy it, you see. You can, when George Bush said, and I've heard him say, we have the best medical system in the world, the most advanced medical system in the world, and you've got 40 million people out there. Do you know what it means to face a major illness without any health insurance? Yes. Right, you do. I do too, ma'am. I remember going for an epidural shot in my back. I had this terrible thing, a procedure that took all of 5 minutes. Now I got a captive audience. You listen to my problems here. 5 minutes it took, a half hour on a gurney, not even in a room. It was in a hallway where the gurneys were separated by a sheet on a thing. You just pull it around. And then a friend of mine came and she drove the car up and helped me into a wheelchair and got me home. You know what they charged me? They charged me $5,740.80. What's the 80 cents for? I mean, what is this? So when somebody says to you, we've got the best healthcare system in the world,
It's best
for somebody, there are parts of Walter Reed Hospital that work very well for the president and the vice president, but not for the foot soldiers who are sent out to defend the empire. That shows you their class concern and their class perspective. So when reality is radical, there's a limit to how many lies people can swallow about the reality that they're experiencing. All social institutions of capitalist society have a dichotomous tension within them. They must sustain the few and advance the interests of the few while appearing to serve the many. Along with ruling class coercion, we have mass resistance and skepticism. Along with institutional stability, we have popular ferment and popular innovation and resistance at times. Don't you ever think for one moment that they don't care what you think. They don't care what you think. Oh man, that's the only thing about you that they care about. What you think. That's what they're doing. Cheney's trip to that aircraft carrier and all that stuff. Every day they're putting on a show. They're waging their propaganda war. Not in Iraq, not in Latin America. There too. Yeah, they have a U.S. Agency of Information. What is it called? Information. AID. Yeah, they have that stuff. But the country, the place they target most with all their propaganda, most of the things they do are directed to the American public because the empire feeds off that republic. So they lie and they conjure false issues to distract or flatter or frighten the people or in some other way to win over and immobilize the public, or sometimes when they have no choice, they have to actually make real concessions to democratic demands. Years ago, the American philosopher William James observed how custom and culture can operate as a sedative, while novelty and dissidence are rejected as an irritant. Yet I would argue that after a while, sedatives can become suffocating and irritants can enliven. People sometimes hunger for the discomforting perspective that gives them a more meaningful explanation. By being aware of this, we have a better chance of moving against the tide, a better chance of resisting the deadening hand of fundamentalist free market plutocracy, a better chance of exposing the dominant paradigm for the sinister, suffocating, dirty little box that it is. Thank you, brothers and sisters.
Are you familiar with Alex Carey, Taking the Risk Out of Democracy, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and Nationalist Association? They apparently did a hell of a lot more than just be against the labor union. End of World War I, end of World War II, and during the Carter era, a tremendous media blitz in schools. It's a little bit of a dense book to read.
Well, that's what I mean when I say they're against. They didn't just say we're against. They waged campaigns against these things.
They turned union people against their own union.
Yes. Why not? Let's hear. I don't want to hear just from men. I also want to hear from some of the women. So.
I'm an indigenous, Native American woman from the Navajo Reservation.
I don't have any questions to ask because I knew it.
Also a graduate of this university in Hull Systems Design.
Mm-hmm.
And
Did everybody hear that? Back in the cheap seats? She's an indigenous Native American woman, and also a graduate of this university. Go ahead, but you got to speak louder now, please. Yeah.
So I was born and I grew up on the Navajo Reservation, and I worked in health and human services for over 20 years in behavioral health, mental health, and social services. Everything from every job there is, from outreach to director. And I watched the money of your taxpayer dollars. We justify those dollars, so it's really a federal money laundry system. And I'm wondering if you...
Explain that, would you? What do you mean?
Everything that you're saying about foreign aid, everything that I could say and tell you...
Yeah, you must know a lot about imperialism, being a Native American. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. And
firsthand.
I know about it also from my own language worldview, which we do have a word. We have a word that is very diagnostic, that says people who use their five senses as a weapon against themselves and others. But what I'm getting to is that anything that I can tell you about a federal money laundering system on any reservation in this country, that every year you pay taxes for this, is exactly the same dynamics that you're explaining.
And where does the money go? Where does this money go?
Well, you pay taxes, and then the more suffering and death on a reservation, we justify the need for the dollar, and then the tribal government is a mechanism for contracting to private industry, and so border towns become millionaires. So that's just the gist of it. But it's exactly the same as foreign aid, the way you're describing right now. And so my question is, do you know about that? Because probably all of you who pay taxes don't know that your taxes are paying for exactly the same thing, a human sacrifice,
Right.
suffering and death of people, of the indigenous people of this country.
Right. It's a system of internal colonialism. Yes, and I didn't make much mention about it, but I didn't make any mention. I appreciate your mentioning. I think there are people here who are aware of it, but more should be done about it or said about it. Yeah. Thank you.
What type of economic system do you think would work, and how do you enforce that in a democracy?
what kind of economic system? Well, at this stage of historical development, I don't see why we can't have public ownership of things like transportation systems. They could be much better. In the countries where they're publicly owned, they're much better. Trains are faster and this and that. The communication systems, the utility systems. Why shouldn't they be publicly owned? Why must someone make a profit every time you've got to put a light on in a house? Why was some fraction of the money you got to pay for that got to go to somebody so he can go skiing off in Switzerland or whatever he does, or yachting off the coast? So you could start like that, public ownership of these basic major things, and then you could have a private economy, but you should also have rigorous control and regulations, right, for the public interest. Right now, Denmark and Finland and Norway and Sweden are looking pretty good. These guys are trying to get us back to America of 1900. Well, America of 1900 was a third world country. I mean, it had tremendous underemployment, tremendous poverty, tuberculosis, rickets, diphtheria, the diseases of the poor people would die from, pneumonia, things like that. We were a third world country before the term was ever, was invented yet. And we've had a century of struggle to get us to where we are now, and their goal is to get us back there. Get us back there. The hungrier and poorer you are, the harder you will work for less and less. That's why people in Haiti or Indonesia work for 15 cents an hour. It's not because we won't work. Anybody here would work for 15 cents an hour? No. It's not because we're so much more self-respecting. It's because we've reached a level of historical struggle where we have something close to a living wage. But life is getting tougher and tougher, and this is their goal. So I would like to see the reactionism defeated and rolled back and moving more closer to a social democracy. Let's see. I guess that, yes, Miss.
Do you have a vision beyond democracy then?
A vision beyond democracy?
Yeah.
No, I'd like to get a chance to see democracy first. I mean, look, this could be another whole lecture. In fact, I've given this lecture. I gave it at a little library thing. I get a sucker. I don't like to get so many of these pro bono local, but when it's a library, I always say yes. But I did this thing on the vote in America. I mean, the history of the vote in America is a history of struggling to get the vote. It's a history of limiting the vote, defranchising people, and that sort of thing. It's still going on now, big time, still going on, stealing elections and depriving people of the vote. There are state legislatures all over that are passing these ridiculous ID laws, where if you present an ID, if your driver's license says John Q. Smith and your voter registration thing says just John Smith, you didn't use the middle initial, then the driver's license won't be accepted as a legitimate ID or something, or spelling, all this kind of crap. What are they doing this for? What? So that they argue is to prevent fraudulent voting. This administration has spent 6 years coming up with solutions to things that aren't problems, and this is what they do to advance their agenda. I'm going to take only one more question because I really am. What?
Yes, I want to go back to where you said there is some hope, and that it's the people develop some kind of skepticism about all of this. But what do you suggest people do after they develop the skepticism?
Well, to mobilize and to organize individually, there may not be that much you can do as an individual. I mean, because I'm a special case, I get to speak and write and go all over. But I go on demonstrations. I write letters to political figures for this cause or that cause. I always add my name to the petitions that come to me on the email, and they all seem to come to me. And so these are some of the things you can do, and you can join an organized effort with other people, electoral causes and such. I really think it's very important to be giving more of our relatively limited efforts and resources to political counter-propaganda against what the right is doing. It turns out that people on the left give more money to political things than people on the right. Now that's news. But they give money to good causes. They're good. I do, to save the whales, solar cookeries for women in Africa, Meals on Wheels for the poor in my community. I can go on with about 10, 15 of these things that I write checks. I pledge myself to write checks for. I'd like to give more, and I think we all should be giving more, and I do now. I'm giving consciously to those who are putting out political education and political counter-propaganda against the prevailing propaganda. The right doesn't give money to those causes. They want to kill the whales. They don't care about solar cooking and this, that, the other thing. They don't even give money to the veterans groups, the disabled veterans and such, or very little. Their money goes into this thing, everything we're talking about today. They go out to make sure they can control reality. Ideas have consequences. They have to control those ideas, and they've been doing a very good job. The Republican National Committee is vastly more intelligent and more resourceful than the Democratic Party leadership. It's vastly more. The Democratic rank and file and followers are vastly more intelligent than the Republican rank and file. But that leadership is terrific. The Democrats don't have a clue as to what they're doing. They're reactive, in most cases, they don't really quite know. They're always worried that they might go too far. They're always dressing up their right. You go listen to any of those talk shows, and who is it? Who's sucking up? It's the liberals. They're saying, "Well, I agree with Joe Fascist there, who's his comments." There's a lot that we can agree on. You never hear the reactionaries saying that. They're not afraid of anything. They push and they push, and they go to control that universe of discourse. They go to control and create the dominant paradigm. They could have written this talk, maybe not as intelligently, and but they, what was the other point I wanted to make? The example, what do they do about radio? What the hell has the American labor movement done about radio? It hasn't done a goddamn thing in 80 years. You can't find a single one of them. Your average labor leader, even take a first generation tough guy on the docks, on the street, he rose from leadership. A camera comes, he runs the other way. He doesn't know what to do. That's okay. But they have, in labor unions today, they have a lot of intelligent, bright, articulate, progressive guys. What do they all do? They're all dedicated to helping the membership, getting another contract, seeing if we can organize here. They're doing the work. They don't go out there. Meanwhile, what are the conservatives doing? They've convinced the American public that labor unions had too much power. What a joke. Back in the 60s, they did that. That the labor unions are obsolete, that we don't really need them anymore. They played their role and fulfilled their role, and now we're moving on. They go out and they put out a line. You can't get one. If one labor union had bought one radio station, but what do the right-wingers do? They got Clear Channel, and they go out and buy up 1,200 radio stations. First, they make sure they get the law changed. They deregulate the ownership patterns so there can be greater concentration. They have campaigns. They know what they're doing. What do they do about the federal judiciary? I'll tell you what they did over the last 25, 30 years. They've taken it over. They consciously went out there. Ronald Reagan and his boys, who everybody kept saying, he's so stupid, he's so stupid. And the liberals are never happier than when they're rocking on the heels and talking about how the guys who are giving it to them up one side, down the other, are stupid. They don't even know what they're doing. He knew what he was doing. They went out there. They went to the law schools. They found these young reactionaries in their 30s and 40s and appointed. No more judges being appointed when they're 60 and 70. They appointed them in their 30s and 40s so they'd be on that bench for the next half century. That's everyone in the look at the Supreme Court. And what did Clinton do when he came into power? He left first of all, he left office with half of about 100 seats still empty that he hadn't appointed. But when he did appoint people, there was no conscious idea of redressing the balance. He had a great opportunity. He never did because he was afraid, because he was half Republican himself, which is the other problem. So we have to, people always say, what do we have to do? We have to make a counter-propaganda. We have to get our word out. We have to argue these issues. Argue and talk to people and let them know where their real interests lie. Thank you very much.